Good evening, everybody. I would like to call the January 10th, 2019 meeting of the Water and Sewer Advisory Committee to order. First item on here is the adoption of tonight's agenda. Do I have a motion to do so?
Motion. Second.
All those in favor, say aye. Raise your hand.
Aye.
Thank you very much. Approval of the minutes from the November 8th meeting.
Make a motion to approve. Second.
Just moving the meeting right along. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any naysayers? Motion approved. Going right on through there, item 4, 2020 CIP. Talia, you are up.
Thank you. So tonight we're going to discuss our 2020 CIP projects. So last time when we met in November, we discussed what was ongoing in FY19. So you will see some repeats, some projects that have been extended into 2020. So we'll give an update and then what we'll plan to see in 2020. So again, this is where we left off, and again, it's our process. So what we're working on right now in-house is continuing the process of refining that scope, as well as evaluating some of the funds. And what we will get into in the future is presenting the draft CIP to council and eventually the final CIP being adopted. Tonight's review is going to consist of, like I said earlier, our ongoing FY20 CIP projects, our new projects that have been added, as well as some discussion with our well and wellhouse projects, which Wally will speak on. Coming up, we have 6 water projects and 5 sewer-related projects. So moving forward with that. First, we have our Park Regional Pump Station and Western Trunk Sewer. And also in front of you all, you have a packet. So if you flip through the packet, we are going in order. So those are our CIP descriptions. So you'll see a lot of additional information in there. But this project, currently we're just over our 95% design. And in 2018, we decided that, or the engineer decided that it would be best to split this into 3 phases. So what we will see coming up in FY20 is going to be the funding for the construction of phase 1.
Going back to the Parkwood one.
Yes, ma'am.
So this is just bringing it to our current lift station, the main lift pump station, not the new line across, or is
This
new?
is the new line,
This
the
is?
new station and the new line across. Yes, ma'am.
Okay,
So this would be in the Williamsburg Plantation area.
that's going to go through.
Yes.
Thank you.
So in our most recent model run, I don't know if you recall, but it's probably been 8 or 10 months now. Greg did an update on our wastewater collection system. We talked about the latest model run actually showed that we had slightly more capacity in our system, in that area of our system, than we had originally thought that the previous model had showed. So that's where we decided to split this project into 3 phases. The first phase would be an upgrade of an existing trunk sewer that runs kind of generally between Williamsburg Plantation and Woodlands Park. If you can imagine, there's a creek that runs between those that kind of separates those neighborhoods, and it runs generally along that creek. So the good thing is we wouldn't be constructing the station at this point, and all that will do is add existing capacity. Basically, it's smaller diameter lines, and we're going to have to do that section anyway. So there's an advantage of moving that piece forward first. And then we would look at building the station and the force main as a later phase of that project. And as you'll recall, the funding for that was revenue bonds. So we would have to issue revenue bonds. And as you're going forward, the LGC, the local government commission, wants to see that you have at least 75% of the project bid before you can issue any bonds. So we would actually construct some of that up front, and that would count toward our 75%, and then we'll have the rest of that when we go to bid. So that's why we split it into 3 phases.
Okay, thank you.
Wally, I thought the design was complete. Looking at this, it looks like you don't have up there that you're going to need to do additional designing in 2020.
I think there's the engineering design that you see hanging over is probably just some additional, there are some additional things will have to be done. The overall project's at 95% or so complete. As a matter of fact, we've actually obtained all but 1 easement or so for the construction of that project also.
Very good.
So you also have design in 2021.
That would be a follower. The 3rd phase of this project includes changes to the Carolina Force Pump Station and Force Main. So there may need to be additional design associated with that phase of the project.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So the next project is the Decatur lift station elimination. This is in our preliminary in-house design as we left it with our last meeting in November. So what we'll see here is our Decatur lift station, and the yellow line represents a proposed gravity sewer to an existing gravity line. And what we see in 2020 is the engineering and beginning some of the construction work, which will continue into FY21.
And to add to that, the great thing about possibly being able to eliminate this station is, of course, that allows us to focus our maintenance, our ongoing maintenance and operations in other areas. So
This
that
is
it
the
would
one
take.
that always flooded and all, wasn't it?
This one it's actually a very shallow wet well that sits right beside a creek, and it's got suction lift pumps on it, which if they lose prime, you have to prime them physically, like manually prime them to get it back running.
And it's beside a creek that
Yeah,
floods.
and we have, if I remember correctly, it's less than an hour of holding time in that station. So if something happens in the middle of the night, by the time we respond, we have just a few minutes to get the station up and running before we have an issue. And it's literally right beside the creek.
Okay.
So all the easements and fun stuff obtained for that one?
Not yet. The good thing is we will be using existing easements that the city already has. But we will need, I think we need a few connecting things, but right now we're doing survey work to ensure that it can flow by gravity to where we want to tie it in. And then that design will be done in-house by Talia.
The Holiday City Mobile Home Park. So right now, this is, we have a program underway for flow monitoring. In 2020, we will have funds available for engineering, but depending upon the monitoring program, we'll ultimately decide which direction we end up going with that project. So this is the area of the Holiday City.
The lift station is actually right down in here, and there's a portion of the park, may get it a little bit off, but it's essentially this portion that goes a different direction. But this, and the city does have a line that comes in and generally comes like this. That's what the city's responsible for. Everything else in there is what the park is responsible for. And I know we've done updates on this a couple of times, but the peak factor that we see during a rain event is in the 20 range. So that means 20 times the amount of water in normal flow. We're working with the engineer for the park to set, I think we've already set flow meters, but the city also has some flow meters that we've set so that we can monitor our flow and then they can monitor their flow, and we can look at, we can try to identify problems. Originally we looked at maybe it's possible to replace all of the infrastructure in the park and the park pay for it, and then we would take over maintenance long-term as an incentive. The estimate was in the $6 million range or so. So we determined that was not feasible. So we're looking at other alternatives. And this, you know, the original request, the problem we have is with the peak, the lift station's undersized. So we've either got to address the peak or we've got to address the lift station. Something is going to have to be done in the near future. But they're funding the engineering and the flow monitoring on their sections, and we're handling what's on ours.
When will we get reports on that monitoring?
We've had conversations, and basically we agreed on where meters should be set, and we haven't received anything from them about how long I don't remember how long the flow monitoring would go for. So, but it could be in the next couple of months that we see something.
So are they currently monitoring right now?
Yes.
They have done it, okay.
Yes.
What are you hoping that the monitoring will, I mean, you already know it's 20 times during the
Yes.
whole.
I think what they're trying to do is pinpoint some of the target areas
There might
and
be,
determine whether it's, inflow, it's coming directly into the pipe, or whether it's infiltration where it's coming in around the pipe.
is it set up such that they might be able to say, okay, this section of the place is okay, our main problem is over here, so maybe they can narrow their focus?
That's what they're trying to narrow down. Because everything comes to this bottom line that's ours. So, it unfortunately runs underneath the homes. So we have cleanouts, manholes, are all up underneath homes. So creates additional challenge.
But that's not ours, that's theirs.
That's theirs.
But it goes into ours.
But it comes into ours. So they've got, I haven't checked, but the logical place to monitor is down here before you tie in.
Our next project is the Bryn Mawr Force Main relocation. So this is our redirect from our Bryn Mawr, which you can see in the picture, down to the Marine Corps base at Virginia. And so right now we are doing a feasibility study to see if this is possible and look at the financial aspect of it as well. So in 2020 we foresee engineering work, but this will go to council, I believe, early March.
I'm going to give council a brief update on just following on what Greg had started, talking about the wastewater collection system and treatment. I'm going to follow along in that series at the end of this month with city council. So if you're available on the 22nd, feel free to come out and hear the next round.
Our water plant chemical tank base repair, this came in over budget. So our engineer is revising the scope by changing some of the materials for an add deduct, change minor things. The overall scope of the project is staying the same, and we will re-advertise this project. So in the coming fiscal year, we do plan to see construction occur.
I thought that had been done.
It's not complete.
It
was almost double the budget?
Yes.
We bid it, it was just almost double the budget.
Oh, wow, okay.
And we did take some of the issues was that we had asked the general contractor to deal with the sulfuric acid, but we've taken that responsibility off of them, so we're hoping that will ease a few minds and give them more time to understand the project.
How bad is it getting the deterioration of the concrete?
I mean, it's certainly working on it, and it's something we're going to have to address. I mean, it's not something that it's an emergency and we gotta fix it tomorrow, but it's certainly starting to work on the concrete.
Are they gonna replace it with are you planning on replacing it with the same thing that's there now, or is there some way to do this better?
No, they're looking at coating, a
Okay.
coating that
All right.
would be chemical resistant.
So are they gonna get rid of the bad concrete and put good concrete and then coated, or?
I don't know if there was a leveling course or any, I'm assuming there's probably some sort of leveling course. I didn't get into the design of the project, but it would make sense that they would put some sort of cap or grout or something down and then put a coating down. And I think part of the project also deals with, we have always had priming issues. It is this one, right? When the chemical gets low, the level is actually below where we're pumping from. So it creates issues with feeding the pumps. So this project would also address some of those issues. That is this one, right?
Yes, sir, it's raising those a bit as they're below grade, once they get about 3 feet. And it's a constant battle to get it uphill to the pumps. We have to keep repriming and repriming and repriming. So, yeah, they need to be raised a little bit too.
Okay.
Moving into our new FY20 CIP projects. We'll start with the Ellis pump station upgrades. Now, this isn't actually a new project. It is a new name. So what we've done here is combine 2 previous projects that have been in our CIP. And that is the Ellis lift station site work and our biofilter upgrades at Bryn Mawr and Ellis pump station. So this project does include what was slated to occur in our FY14 that you see. FY18, we separated biofilter upgrades at Bryn Mawr. That will begin in FY21. So we won't see that in this conversation, but we will see that coming forward.
Can we give a?
Yes. So this new project does include, again, the previously slated work of the biofilter upgrades, as well as site improvements. Because of Hurricane Florence, it did become a priority. So we did have some issues there flooding. So the focus right now is going to be site improvements regarding the flooding, whether we can allow access during flood events or whether we can somehow reduce the amount of flooding that occurs there. So again, the current status, we are waiting for a proposal from the engineer, and dependent upon those findings, we will adjust FY20 for what we see. And additional funding, we do foresee having to increase this.
Can we go back? One more. During the storm, the water was at least at that level. It was 2 to 3 feet inside the building, and we did have damage to some of our control cabinets. And we recognize the FY14 site work project. I know, and I can anticipate the question of why do we have a project hanging around from FY14. The original scope of that project was to literally build a berm right around the station such that we kept the station from flooding. Well, due to the floodway and the floodplain, we found we were not, it wasn't even permitted. We wouldn't be permitted to do that. So we recognize the importance, and of course Florence highlighted that, of figuring out how to deal with this station. And we've looked at everything from relocating the station to waterproofing. So we're trying to figure out what the best course of action will be. So that's why we've combined that project. And then the biofilter was literally for this component over here. And I think you'll remember we had conversations about this before. It was actually paired with the one at Bryn Mawr. The one at Bryn Mawr. And we've split those 2 projects and pushed the one in Bryn Mawr out a year to allow us to deal with this. And, we told you that we would be comfortable doing that. It wasn't something we felt like we had to get crammed in this year also. But a couple of the options we've looked at, we haven't costed out yet, so we don't know what that total cost will be. So in the future, that may be one, based on the engineer's recommendations, that we come back and have to amend the project cost. But at this point, we're not sure what direction we're going. We've determined that relocating the station isn't feasible.
Because of cost?
Cost and piping.
Okay,
So, because it's fed gravity.
okay.
And then on top of that, if we were to, we have to do something sooner rather than later. If we were to relocate the station or figure out how to relocate the station, redo the piping getting to the station, one of the stations that feeds this is the Bryn Mawr station. So then if you redirect Bryn Mawr, if that determines that is, it comes through as our model is predicted and as a good, very cost-effective way of dealing with some of our treatment and collection, then you would take 1 million gallons a day roughly off of this station. So then if we reconstruct it now at a new location, we would be building it for the future. Or if we decide, we'll relocate it at that time, now we've got to wait for several years before we can ever address the station. So we've determined the station pretty much has to stay where it is. But we are looking at alternatives. If you'll go back one more. We are looking at alternatives right up from where this is taken. The city actually owns property all the way to Ellis. And Ellis did not flood because of elevation change. So there are alternatives of possibly setting remote controls for the station up on the higher ground and then flood proofing the building. So if something happens, we could troubleshoot from the higher elevation, but if something fails, we won't have access to the building until the flood goes down.
How would that address the biofilter?
We would look at relocating the biofilter also. That's one of the options that we're looking at because that's piping air. So, larger blower, it's something feasible, but there's no way to move the whole station.
Can you move the biofilter itself?
We could, and we've also talked about moving the generator.
Okay.
We've talked about putting the biofilter on the roof also. So there are options.
Okay, but that
We
can
just
be
don't know
moved
where we're
somewhat.
headed. Yes.
How high does that water get there when you have a flooding area?
On normal conditions, we've seen it up around where those pumps sit. We've seen just heavy rainfalls. I mean, for those of us that have been here a long time, we know that Hardison Hills floods in every heavy rain event. And part of that's due to Scales Creek.
I know you've got in here that you had to use a small boat to get around to some of these.
We have, and we've used the small boat when water didn't get in the station. But in this event, water was 2-3 feet inside the station.
But you need one to get up at times if it was flooded bad enough up to where the door is at there?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. And we've talked about, as part of the FY14 project, we talked about building a boardwalk from that higher elevation into the station.
What are you gonna
That would
access
be
through the
better,
roof?
yeah.
We have talked about,
Accessing
actually,
through the
we have
roof.
talked about making the station watertight and then putting a roof access in. The challenge with that is it actually becomes a confined space. So we have to deal with different access regulations. And there's no way in an event like Florence, we would put anybody in a confined space like that. So we would just let the station go anyway. So we'll be back in front of you with this project in the future.
So our I&I, our Inflow and Infiltration, this is a recurring project that we have every 2 years. The first year is our design and identification. Our second year, which will be FY20 for us, is the construction. And the two areas we've identified are Sherwood and Wantland sewer basins. So here is our Wantland area.
This is in the downtown area, right near the river, obviously.
And then our Sherwood.
This is over kind of behind Dunkin' Donuts on 17.
Next is our water plant maintenance bridge. So the purpose of this bridge is to access the top of the trains, access the fans and electrical equipment, and not just a one-time thing, but ongoing maintenance. So we have had some issues with the fans not working, which does create further problems in there, which we will see, especially as the humidity does increase. when we get more into the spring, summer. And now when we discuss our wells and our well houses, I'm gonna pass it back to Wally, he's been working with all of these.
I'm going to take a sidebar for just a moment to talk about something we've talked about several times. We've talked multiple times about the Black Creek Aquifer and the withdrawal reductions that the city has faced. Not just the city, the other water purveyors that pull from the Black Creek Aquifer. Where we stand right now is, as of August 1st, 2018, the city has taken a 75% reduction. So originally we were permitted for roughly 4 million gallons per day. So currently we're permitted to withdraw 1 million gallons per day. The state came out actually right at 2 years ago and said, we will issue temporary permits, temporary meaning that at any point you violate one of these criteria, we can take it away from you. So while I say temporary, doesn't mean it's only good for a certain period of time. What that means is it's good until you start violating one of these criteria. And then they delineated 4 criteria, and those are static water levels are increasing, chloride levels are not trending upward. That means the water, the aquifer is not getting saltier. And then pumping levels are above the top of the aquifer. So what that means is, imagine an underground river. Well, if you put a pipe into it, it has pressure. What it does is it starts pushing water up. And we're all familiar with the term artesian well. It's where water's bubbling up out of the ground and it's just groundwater. So what's happening is the pressure is pushing up into the well that we've drilled. So what they're saying is, when you start pumping, you're not pulling so much out that water is coming out of that well that you've put into the aquifer. And then your pump intakes, where you set the pump, is above the top of the aquifer. And what that means, if you think about those two things, they kind of work hand in hand. If your pump intake's above the top of the aquifer, but your water's below the top of the aquifer, guess what you can't pump? So those two kind of work together. I'll show you in a minute. I think you remember Dr. Sproul coming and talking to you. We built 3 monitoring wells in the Burton Park area. We monitored those for a year, and then it was our understanding that the state would take over monitoring past that. Well, partially our fault. We didn't send the state written correspondence that said, hey, you need to take this over. We did talk about it in meetings, but we didn't actually send them the correspondence to say, hey, you need to take over the monitoring. So we've had monitoring wells in for 2 years. We gathered data monthly, I think, for the first year, and then it kind of sat. And then we came back at the end of 2 years when we realized that the state hadn't been monitoring it and said, well, we're going to go ahead and monitor it again. So we have kind of a starting point monthly for the first year. And then we just wanted to see where we were. So we came back at the end of a year. The whole time we've been using the Black Creek, we just weren't monitoring from these monitoring wells. And we pulled another sample. So I have the results in abbreviated form. The actual study is quite lengthy, but here's the abbreviated form, and this is and the other thing I'll add to that is, the city and Onwassa both pull from the Black Creek. So we're in this boat together. We're in the same area. We're pulling from the same parts of the aquifer. So this is the cities. We have, the study has the same graph for Onwassa, and then it has a graph that puts us together. But roughly they look very similar. So our permit works in total gallons per year. I know I broke it down to average gallons per day, 4 million gallons per day. Well, that's the 1.48 billion gallons per year. So that's just a total. So our permit works off of a total. So this was where we started, and then a reduction was the first 25%. And another 25%. Here's where we are today. We're down in here. So our permit is 0.37 billion gallons per year, or roughly 1 million gallons per day. What we have is, or the purple line shows our pumping levels from the Black Creek. So you can see that, this original line, and I don't know, this unfortunately predates me, but originally at this point where our permit level was set, it was supposed to be based off of your usage. But if you look across the state, some are very close like ours, and some are a lot higher. There's a big difference between what they were pumping and what their permitted level was set at. So I don't know exactly how the original permit levels got set, but you can see where we've been operating. So you can see that we were, during this time period, we were withdrawing more than our permitted level. And then that kind of continued as we had to take the first reduction. But in 2010, right in this time frame, is where our plant came online for the Castle Hang. And you can see what happened immediately. We got down below our permitted levels and we kind of stayed there. And then when we had to take the next reduction, we just changed where we would, the amount we were withdrawing from the Black Creek and increased what we were producing from our water plant from the Castle Hang. I think Kevin, can you erase that for me, please? This graph tells a great story. It shows that, one of the things that we have been, one of the things that they were concerned about is that we were, and when I say we, it's the we collective from all of the water purveyors that pull from the Black Creek, we were overdrawing the Black Creek Aquifer. So we were actually withdrawing more than it could recharge. I think the great thing about this graph is it shows that as we come down, it's pretty obvious what starts happening kind of in this area. You notice that the water level, this blue line, is the level of the aquifer. So this line here is the water level measured in the aquifer. So as you can see, we kind of move along, and as we come down from the Black Creek starts going up. Well, if you look, especially, if you key in on out in this area, look at the trend of the Black Creek compared to our pumping level. This, if I go back, this takes care of the static water levels are increasing. You can't argue that. The Black Creek is recharging at a great level. Matter of fact, when we met with the state, we actually had a discussion of where was the turning point. I would argue that the turning point was kind of in here where I drew my line, and there's discussion. The state really, kind of focused in over here.
Jim?
Down.
The state kind of focused in over here at, look at this increase. And then what they really liked was there's a kind of a little, it's still increasing, but there's kind of a little plateau in that area. So, this is, it gets down to at what level do we want to see the recovery. But the great thing is it shows that the static water levels are increasing. Secondly, we had to look at the chloride levels and show that they were not trending upward. So the first thing I'll point out is obviously there was a lab error. Chlorides are read, for those of you not familiar, you basically have to compare colors. And so it can vary from tester to tester. And there are electronic methods. So what we did as we got later in the report, you'll actually see that, in here, there's multiple tests kind of in the same area. And in here, we have notes in the report that show this. But in here, we kind of were pulling multiple samples and testing them multiple ways. And you can see the greatest one is, I told you it sat for a year. So you can see that we kind of ticked along in here. It sat for a year. We went and resampled again, and you can see, to me, we tested 4 different ways for chlorides. The low was 48, the high was 57, the average of the 4 were 54. Well, if you come back 2 years prior, you're in kind of this 42, 53, 47 range. So the state agreed there is no upward trend in chloride levels. And actually, when we trended it out in the report, it shows that it's flat or slightly declining. And that deals with, it's not an exact, when the lab's testing, and the other thing I'll say is for drinking water, below 250 is the standard. So when the lab's testing, they weren't trying to hit an exact number. Most of the labs, especially the drinking water labs, are verifying that you're in a general range, and that range is well below 250. So we did have some challenges, but the state agreed with us that our data shows that the chloride levels are not trending upward. So we've met the first 2 items. I already talked about how the pumping levels, I talked about the pumping levels above the top of the aquifer. We take static and pumping levels all the time. Our pumping levels show, our documents show that we also meet that criteria. The challenge we're currently facing is finding documents from the 60s that show what our pump intake levels are. And they want to see, we have levels on file, but we don't know where those came from. They're just keyed in. So the state needs to see actual records of where our pump intakes are set. So that's what Joe is currently working on now, is trying to come up with, for our 12 Black Creek wells, what our pump intake levels are set at.
Is there a thought of sending a camera down?
Well, there is, but to do that, you have to pull the pumps. So it is not a cheap thing to do. So we actually have, we've talked about, we're trying to find all that we can find records on. And then what we'll do is we'll figure out whether or not we have to pull the rest of them. And we may. And there's some that we're probably going to pull in camera anyway, because there's a couple that we have varying results over time. And that could be, Dr. Sproul is very quick to look at that data and tell us, in his opinion, especially for one of our wells, he thinks it's a well construction issue from the date it was constructed. And the well log actually shows that the well was over drilled and then abandoned to a certain level, which would support his thought that it was not, that it's a well construction problem. And that's why we're getting varying reads when we go to that well. So there are a few that we're going to have to deal with. But the good news is, we talked about this with the state, and they're willing, provided we meet that last criteria of providing our pump intake levels, they will support not making us take the full reduction. So then it comes down to, at what level do we think we would be permitted at? And based on Dr. Sproul's recommendation, our request is probably going to be to stay right around that 3rd reduction, which is roughly 2 million gallons a day.
So right now you are pumping at the lower rate.
Well, right now we are pumping, you can see this is our last data point from July of 18. But part of that, the reason for that is because we are running very few wells on the 258 side. Because if you remember, a truck drove into our chlorine station, so we can't use wells 1 through 5 at all anyway. So we're down to 6 and 7 on the 258 side, and then we still have our wells in the Gum Branch area, 11 through 18. So we're down 5 wells. We weren't using one of them anyway, but when we lost the chlorine station, we lost all of those wells. So the level that we're probably going to request is that 0.74, which is where we were before we would have to take this last reduction in August of 2018. The good news is the way we're permitted on an annual basis. So it's a total. So if we used, and we wouldn't do this, but if we used 0.37 billion gallons between between January and July, but then didn't use any more, then we wouldn't be out of compliance. Of course, that's not how we do it. So it may be that we continue, pumping somewhere above that 0.37 billion gallons right now, that 1 million gallons a day. We may continue, we've been operating between 1 and 1.5. We found that works very well for our water treatment plant. It's producing roughly 3 to 4 million gallons a day. It just seems to operate very well there. And then we're supplementing with the Black Creek Aquifer, and that makes out our daily demand. So on any given day, it may be between 1 and 1.5 million gallons a day, which is over that average of 1. But we can operate like that for 6 months, and if we get our temporary permit and it comes in at 0.74, we will have never been out of compliance. So I take a sidebar into that because we have 3 Black Creek projects.
One question before you go there.
Yes.
How much savings is it to get that 1 million gallons per day increase? It's cheaper to use the black.
It is significantly cheaper to operate out of the Black Creek because all we do, we literally just have to chlorinate it and pump it to our citizens.
Okay, so what's the difference between that and the?
We haven't ever sat down and calculated the difference, but the saving is fairly significant.
And it would cover all the costs that we have to invest to
Oh,
get to
absolutely.
that point.
Absolutely.
I'm just asking.
And on top of that, we're at the point right now where we have a good rotation with what we're operating in a Castle Hayne well field. While we have permitted water levels above what we're operating at right now, to pull much more, like if we wanted to make up another 1 million gallons out of the Castle Hayne, we need more wells. So we're at the point right now where we're kind of operating in a really good spot. The plant's operating well. We have a good mix. We have, what the consumers really wonder about is odor and taste. We have a really good blend for odor and taste. So we don't want to lose that extra 1 million gallons per day because as we start to grow, we have going back, the difference between operating somewhere in this level and here, we can increase our demand. We can grow some and not have to go pull more out of the Castle Hayne. So it gives us flexibility to operate. And in addition, some of these where, and I'll go back to this, you see we're operating kind of here. This spot right here correlates, if you'll remember, we had an issue at the water plant. We had to take the water plant completely offline for several months to replace one of the pipes inside the water plant. It was actually the bypass line.
And that's the Castle Hayne water.
And that's Castle Hayne water. So what happened is we're not pulling from the Castle Hayne during that period. So obviously our usage from the Black Creek went up because we still had demand. So it gives us flexibility should we have to take our plant offline for a period of time for operation or maintenance. It just gives us greater flexibility. It gives us room to deal with growth. So we want to make sure that we try to get the higher permit, not just because it's cheaper, but it also gives us greater flexibility.
The wells that went offline because of the accident, are they expected to come back on anytime soon?
We're gonna talk about that in just a minute. That's a great question.
Well, I think it's important though for the audience that's watching to understand that with all this hydrology and geekness that we've been talking about, that getting that extra million back will keep the pressure off of rates going up, which for a lot of people, they might not appreciate all the other things that we're talking about that we appreciate, but they do appreciate you saving them money on their water.
That is true.
There's the real big one, sorry, Wally, is when we're operating right now with that amount, we have dropped so much in the customer concerns because the blend is so good of what we're running right now. And if we have to change it, it's basically starting from scratch and going back to find
The good
what
blend.
works for the customers.
Right.
But this blend right here that we have now with this amount of water has probably dropped those 60%.
And on the other hand, if you get permitted at that 50% at 2 million gallon level instead of 1 million gallon, that would be even sweeter,
Yes, sir.
Yes.
sweeter water.
That's right. And then we've got, so we've got 3 projects in the CIP. One is, well, 2 of them are new and 1 is a rollover. So we have the Black Creek raw water supply wells that was on hold. So I guess it's not technically new, we just hadn't started on it. And it was directed at the temporary permit, but this is actually constructing new Black Creek wells. And then we have the one that you just asked about. Wells 1 through 5 are what went through the chlorine station. Well, we also had a project because those wells were built in the 60s and there's been very little, they're just, the well houses are at the end of their life. And the electrical components inside, everything. So what we had a project to actually rehab wells 2, 3, and 4. Well, as we got into it, what we realized is that we had a lot larger issues there than we knew about. And we had, before we spent a bunch of money rehabbing well houses and upgrading electrical equipment, we thought it would be a good idea to camera those wells. And I have the results, and I just read them to you, a summary of them. But well 2 is currently unusable because the camera couldn't pass the 268-foot mark. There's sediment or a pump or a failure that blocks anything below 268 feet. And if you remember, the Black Creek Aquifer is somewhere in the 400 to 600 foot range. So well 3 is questionable for rehab. And the reason is there's numerous holes in joints, there's bad joints, and there's issue that occurred during construction that has continued to fail, obviously, since the 60s. And that one, at some point, we don't know when because it predates both Joe and I, they tried to reline that original well. So they tried to reline it once, so it's not like we could go in there and try to reline it again. And then on well 4, there's a questionable for rehab because it is in the casing. The well is actually beginning to fail and it has multiple holes. And on that one, the screens are nearly completely clogged. So almost clogged. So we have issues with wells 2, 3, and 4. What we're doing now is because we need to know, we talked about where we site the new chlorine station and how we handle it. One of the things that we need to know is if 2, 3, and 4 are this bad, we need to know about well 1 because we had talked about possibly siting a chlorine station in that area. So Talia actually has a change for the contractor to come back and pull well 1 and camera well 1 also.
Do we have
So-
a status on well 5?
We haven't done well 5, it's further down the road.
But it's in the same,
It's in the same vicinity,
and it's
yes.
serviced by the
And
same
same,
chlorine.
yes, and same time frame,
So
construction time
we
frame.
don't know the status. Do we intend to look at that status?
Possibly. We hadn't planned on spending any money at well 5 yet. So it depends what we have to do with pulling the other wells to determine intake levels. Because it's not cheap to pull a well and camera it. I don't know, what was the cost for one? Do you remember the change? Okay, but I can get you that.
Your odds aren't good, though.
They're not. Maybe 1 out of 5.
No one like
Um,
5.
So-
Just wanna give everyone the right bang for their buck, and if going with working on 5 might not be that best option. I could just-
So the third project that we have that's coming, that is new, that would be coming into the window is we were continuing to look at those Black Creek well houses and electrical components that are beginning to fail because they were constructed in the 60s and 70s. And it's kind of an ongoing program, so this was coming into the window. But now we've got three projects all dealing with Black Creek wells, not necessarily in the same area, but, does it make sense given what we're trying to do with the temporary permit to keep 3 separate projects, or should we consider modifying and making 1 project or 2 projects? And as a staff, we kind of sat down and talked about that. So here's the summary. So here's kind of what staff thinks we should do, and we thought this might be a good discussion for the board, is we think that we probably should combine the Black Creek drilling new wells and rehabbing 2, 3, and 4. Because what we're finding is those aren't great candidates to reuse that well.
So you just said rehab
And-
them.
Jointly, we meet with, on WASA as part of the Water Resources Group. And what they shared with us is they actually were doing work at their well 8, and it failed completely. It actually collapsed inside. So they lost the well completely. They had to abandon it.
Is that a similar age to ours?
It is.
Yeah, and you just said rehab, and I thought you couldn't rehab them.
Well, it says it's not a likely candidate. So, they said it was actually very easy, and the state willingly gave them a permit to relocate that well to a new site. And they actually moved it further down. It's kind of in the Union Chapel area. They're moving it to the Union Chapel area. And it moves it a little bit further out of where the cluster of wells in the Black Creek are, so it spreads the aquifer out a little bit more, the use out a little bit more. But they said the permitting was very easy and the state looked favorably on that because they were relocating. So we've had similar conversations internally and with Dr. Sproul about, well, maybe having multiple wells located on a road named Wells Road may not be the best use of the aquifer. So we've had discussions of maybe we need to consider abandoning a couple of the wells right there on Wells Road and look at something in the general vicinity. Or it may be that we could re-drill using newer techniques at one of those locations and get the same production that we were getting out of 2 wells or 3 wells. So we feel like it may be best to combine the first 2 projects because overall, rehab's not a great option for any of those 3 wells. So it may be that we want to recombine those and look for other locations to put a new well and just have one project that addresses the Black Creek aquifer in that area. And then our other is to, if we're going to do this, we'll probably look at well 5 also. And in doing so, what we think we would prefer to do is push out the Wellhouse Rehabilitation project a couple of years. And the reason is the wells that would take care of most of our wells that are on the 258 side. And in talking with Joe, the wells that are located along in the Gum Branch area are in much better condition physically. So he thinks that it would be okay for us to wait a couple of years before we start rehabbing those well houses. So with that, and adding in the component that there may be wells to get the pump intake levels that we actually have to pull the pump out and measure. And if we do that while we've got the pump out, we'll probably go ahead and camera that well so that we can have an evaluation and determine whether that's going to be a viable well long into the future, or whether that's one that, as we go through this effort again, we may need to consider relocating or re-drilling or doing something different. So, for your discussion.
Go right ahead.
Well, we supposed to ask you for well, on this here, it says, there's several, I guess, well sites that were put in 1950 or so. Are they worth redoing, or would they be better off to put in another well system there?
And that's what we're trying to decide.
Could you put, if you've got a well now and you decide to do another one, how close together can you put them, and do you own that property?
Well, if we abandon it, we can put it on the same parcel.
You can,
Yes.
okay, you can do them that close together if the one is shut down?
Yes.
And so it's not a land acquisition problem?
Well, the regulations are slightly different now than when they were drilled.
Sure.
So it may be that, to use the same parcel, we probably would have to acquire some of the property around it.
Mhm.
And we're trying to go through, if we cite, once we get through cameraing well one and determining what we have, we've actually determined that might be a decent location for another well, or for a well.
All right.
So it's, but we might have to acquire some property to re-drill.
I have a couple of technical questions, if you don't mind.
Okay.
One is, you have 18 wells now, 5 are out of production.
Well, we don't have a full 18. We have 1 through 7, so we have 7, and then we have 11 through 18,
Okay.
so 5, so 12.
Is the number that you have, even with the number that are not in production, adequate for what you need to accomplish? Or do you need additional wells regardless of what you do with the ones that are currently capped?
If we get to, not thinking about number of wells, but if we get equivalent to the same number of gallons, whether we combine 2 wells to get one better, if we get to where we were, we will be fine. I don't see us needing more Black Creek wells, especially with the permanent level staying where it is. And it may be that we could, and part of it depends on rotation, because there are regulations on how long you can operate a well before you have to shut it down for a period. So it may be that we could do without 1 well. So it may be that we don't have to replace.
That's the other half of my question was, if you're saying the number of wells that you have, or the number of wells you need for the capacity to meet your mission, can you get that same capacity with fewer wells?
Possibly.
Especially with the new technology that's out there now that will allow you to pump more efficiently.
Possibly,
Possible. But that's something that you're considering in all this.
yes.
Because if we do away with the 1 through 5, you don't have to necessarily replace them with 5 new wells.
Correct. Maybe replace them with 2, or even 1 good one.
That's what I was wondering.
These 1950 and 60 wells are where in the Black Creek?
Yes,
That's all we were taking out of that, wasn't it?
yes.
Well, they're 60, 70 years old when they get ready to, it needs to just be completely replaced, I feel. And try and repair.
Unfortunately, that's what our evidence is showing.
Because some 70 doesn't mean you need to replace it, Jim.
It sounds like, though, what it would cost to rehab them, you'd almost be better off just putting more money in and
Yeah.
getting new wells,
In some
especially with
cases.
better technology.
In some
'Cause
cases.
You're not gonna be able to extend the life of them
That far.
that far.
That's right.
Is there an industry standard for how long wells should last?
I've never researched that, but I can tell you in this area, us and Owasso, because it was the county at the time, we're both still using wells from 50s, 60s, and 70s.
Are they still producing the same amount of water as they were
No.
back then?
At least most of ours are not.
So I was gonna say, how reduced, is it 50%, 25%?
Well,
Yes.
most of it's not because of the aquifer, most of it is because of the pump curves, of the pumps getting old and that stuff. But as far as the aquifer portion, the water portion, that's not really much of an issue, it's our.
I think
Just
that's
not
what she's
pumping as
asking.
efficiently.
We're not pumping what
Yeah.
we
No,
were in the
no.
past because
No.
of the materials,
Yeah.
and some of it changes, think about our system now compared to the 70s
I
and the
asked the-
80s.
I asked the question
Western
not because of the
Boulevard.
aquifer.
The 90s.
I asked the question because of the equipment, because if I buy an air conditioner for my house, the heat pump is good for 15 years. Yes, people run them for 20 or 30, but they're not as efficient, they're not as good. However, after 15 years, you can expect them to break down and die.
Yes.
I was wondering if you had a similar thing for your pumps, in that the ones in the 60s, just like we talked about when you first installed the water treatment plant, that's not gonna last forever.
That's right.
So you have a,
Unfortunately, the pumps, if we get 10 years out of a pump, we've probably done something. I mean, many of our Castle Hayne pumps have had to be replaced because lightning strike, they've shorted out. We've had one spin off. Matter of fact, we put safety cables on because they'll actually spin off the column pipe. And we'll have to we've pulled them up by the wires and we've pulled them up by the safety cable. So if we get that long out of a pump, we're doing something. So, a pump, you're probably talking a whole lot less time. And then on top of that, you have the impellers that tend to wear. So they're certainly not as efficient. But, we can't afford to go replace them all the time either.
I make a proposal that the board puts forward and votes on, that we recommend that the staff does combine these projects so that we do not redo a well house, do not do a well without looking at the totality and do the most efficient thing, not the most expedient. I make that motion.
Do I hear a second to that motion?
Okay? They'll keep them separate then.
I'd just like to hear more information on the new wells and the cost of it and what you would find out about it. I know you say you're gonna look into it, but you don't have quite the information on that yet, right?
Well, I can tell you that one of our Castle Hayne wells, to put a well in and put a well house on it, that doesn't include, tying into the system that assumes the pipe is there. We were over $250,000 per well in just construction. Those were brand new wells.
Total, from start to finish, that's the total.
Yes, they were slightly over 250.
Do you have even an estimate
And that
cost?
was in 2010 timeframe.
Do you have an estimated cost on, I
And
know we're not saying rehab, but rehab or fix the wells that are there?
I don't know what it would cost to, if they're not candidate to rehab, all you're doing is building a new building on top of a old well.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I say, do you even have a rough estimate of what that would be? That to me would determine whether or not it's feasible, and it sounds like it
We
is.
did them separately. Do you remember what the cost of the buildings were each? I can have that real quick, what we spent on just the building.
But you also don't want to
Because when
build
we
a new
built,
building on top of a well that's going to be abandoned.
when we did the Castle Hayne wells, now admittedly, those are a whole lot shallower. You're talking 260-foot range versus 400 or 500-foot range. We did 2 contracts. We drilled the well under one contract and split it and we did the well house and electrical components and generator as a separate contract. So it's pretty easy for me to go back and figure out what just the well cost me and then what just the well house cost us. So I could figure that out real quick.
What gallon per minute pumps do you use there?
It varies. Some of those we weren't getting but 2 to 250 gallons a minute. And then some, what was your highest Black Creek in that area?
The low, I can tell you the lowest and the highest. The highest is well 6 and well 7, and their average right about 600 a pop, 650.
600 to 650 gallons a minute for well 6 and 7.
It's a lot of water.
Well,
And then-
well 5
And well 5 is
was about 120.
120 gallons.
So the electricity costs
See how the
probably
pump can last that long.
even worth saving.
So that's where, you know, if you find a good spot and you put one well, you could conceivably
Not have to
eliminate
rebuild.
a couple
Yep.
and not have to rehab them or rebuild them.
And that's
So-
why I recommended that, you know, which the board didn't accept, but I recommended that we combine them, because if you have a project looking at the well house and rehabilitation and putting in new wells, and they're all going parallel, you might put a new well house on top of a well that you're not gonna rehabilitate because it's not cost effective, or you'll rehabilitate something even though a new well is gonna replace that. So if you don't combine them, I see your original concern, which is,
Spend money you don't need to.
and you also have, you got 3 teams working on 3 different, maybe it's the same person, but they're working in a pipeline type thing. Where if you tell them, hey, they've got to consider all those factors at one time. And I don't think moving the well rehabilitation out to 22, since we're not using those wells right now, is any sort of threat to the water supply or cost to the water or that, so, but.
Well, we have 2, 3, and 4, and then we have well 6 and well 7. We would run either 2, 3, and 4 because the combined total of those 3 was right around 600 gallons a minute. And then the next day we'd run 600 gallons a minute, and the next day 7. So they were spread out through the aquifer, you know, and we were staying within all the regs.
But you don't have 2 and 3 now.
Right, but that's what those 3 equal one of those other wells.
Right.
Okay, based on that, I'll second your motion.
Okay, so after further discussion,
Thank you.
we've had a first and a motion and a second. So any further discussion on it?
So you're talking about wells that in many cases you're thinking can't be rehabbed if it's like what happened with Onwassa's.
Yes.
These wells are done, their life is done.
Or very close to it.
Right.
Not just 2 and 3, and 4, but
Possibly.
probably 1 and 5.
1 and
Yeah,
5 also.
Probably 1 and 5 also.
So you don't want to put new wells.
Yeah,
on top of it.
why are you trying to make them look good with a new well house when they're basically dying?
That's right.
Okay,
We think the option's probably going to be
drill new wells
drill new wells.
and abandon those.
And give them new well houses, because there'll be
Pretty new well
wells
houses.
on top of the new wells.
With all fancy bells and whistles and electronics.
So any further discussion on that? Hearing none, all in favor, say aye.
I
Any opposed? Motion passes.
More important just to scribe have it so that we have it in the minutes.
He rewatches them, so he gets them twice.
Awesome. So our next steps moving forward. So today we did discuss FY20 projects. I'm also scheduling meetings internally so we can develop our financial data, which will also occur this month. Next month, we are looking into providing council with a CIP update. I'm not giving them the full draft. We will finalize that throughout the month. Into March, we will present the draft CIP in this meeting on the 14th, I believe, and then we will also present the draft CIP to council. Moving on to April, we will refine based on comments we receive in this meeting as well as from council, and we will put a final review and present it to you all.
Wally, I didn't hear anything that said we need to squeeze something into the CIP as a result of Florence. I'm understanding, you did mention one item that we already had scheduled that would address Florence's effect, but I'm taking everything else came out well, that we don't need to have it moved up or created new for 2020.
Well, in the CIP,
Yes.
that is correct.
Thank you.
We have We have things where generators were damaged, or we need to replace generators, or control cabinets or pumps or things like that we've had to replace. And that will be done through our equipment replacement plan. So those aren't capital items.
But none of those things
So-
occurred because this capital item was at fault, except in the one case where we had the flooding.
Correct. So those will all be handled as part of our budget and internally, and many of those things we're tracking for either insurance recovery because, our assets are insured, and then FEMA above that. So, if insurance doesn't cover something, FEMA requires you to submit to insurance first. And then from there, we can submit to FEMA. So we are trying to recover costs that we've had. And on top of that, any, even time that was spent on FEMA recovery from Florence, we are submitting to FEMA for possible reimbursement. So we're checking all of that.
I would like to express my thought that it's laudable that you and your staff had the system well prepared, and not knowing Florence was coming, you were still able to manage it in a way that kept water to everybody. And the only CIP thing was something we'd already identified years ago,
Yes.
of building that flooded. Otherwise, I'm sure there's several cities that are having more difficulty with their CIP because they've got to solve problems that Florence showed them. So again, it's laudable what you and your staff have done.
Thank you.
Along
We have
those,
good people.
along those lines, I noticed that there were quite a few water service leaks
Yes.
and cave-ins more than I usually see on these. So are these
And
part
you'll
of?
probably see the cave-ins continue because they're still continuing to show up.
So will that go towards FEMA reimbursement too?
We are tracking, most of that we're fixing internal.
Okay,
So we are tracking time, materials, so that we can submit.
okay. So anybody who starts seeing weird wet spots and all of this weird stuff, they really need to call y'all and
Yes, please let
say,
us know.
we got things going on in the yard?
Yes, and our leaks are, on any given day, we carry, upwards of 10, 12 leaks around the city. So I know people will call in a leak and say, it's been 3 days and you haven't done anything about it, and water's continuing to run down the street. And unfortunately, we've got, 7 or 8 or 9 in front of it that may be worse. So we do try to get to those, and I know it looks like sometimes a leak can last for a while. But I do want to assure everybody that it's not because we're not trying to fix them, they're just coming faster than we can fix them, so we have to prioritize them.
Plus,
But
you're
it-
also saving money because you're doing it in-house, aren't you?
Yeah, we are
Yeah.
doing it in-house, unless, the only time we don't do it in-house is if it's a material or something that we can't handle, or if it's deeper than 5 feet, because we don't have, we are not supposed to go over 5 feet deep.
The chlorine station on 258,
That's part of the Wells 2, 3, 4
that's what they're gonna
project.
do with it.
Yes, ma'am. Most likely, well 6 and well 7 have their own chlorine stations. It's likely that we'll go to something like that, where it's at, one station and it serves multiple, it's at one site and it serves multiple. Or if we re-drill and are able to get one well, then it would be located with that well.
Gonna put it further off the road this time?
We are certainly not putting it back in the same location.
Tank trap.
I went by that right after that happened. It was like, no.
Yes.
Okay, we're on to the old business.
I don't have anything.
No items.
No new business.
How about new business?
No.
Okay, well, hearing no old business and no new business, I will say Happy New Year to everybody. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm waiting on you.
Oh, I thought, you have your hand going up. I thought you were gonna, you want to make a motion
I'll
already,
make a
huh?
motion to adjourn.
You make a motion to adjourn. Anybody opposed to adjourning?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned.
You are gonna have